Today, the goal of our webinar this morning is to talk about what it means to be an effective searcher. And I'm going to cast this in the framework of what it means to be literate at search. And let me tell you a story to get started. So I was doing a field study a couple years ago, and I was watching a woman down in Los Angeles searching for searching through ca.gov through the California vehicle code, looking for the vehicle code about emission control equipment. So she basically did this kind of thing. California vehicle code. And she found it right there, the table of contents. And then she went, what do I do now? I need something about emission control. So I'm going to click on letter E, and now I'm going to start looking for emission control. Now you can see this kind of goes on and on and on and on and on and on. And as I was sitting there watching her look through this, I was wondering why she wasn't using the obvious quick search. Why she wasn't using the Command F control like that to say emission. And you can see, oh, it's actually called pollution control. Oh, no wonder we couldn't figure it out. So now you can come down here and you can use Command F in order to search through the content of the web page. Now, I assume that you, as all search literate people, know this. But the thing that really surprises me is that 90% of the English-speaking U.S. Internet-using searching population, and this includes your students, 90% of them do not know how to do that simple Command F, or on a PC, how to do a Control F. Now, you might have read about this in the Atlantic or New York Times or something, and this was a piece of data that we uncovered a while ago. It's crucial. It's crucial for understanding how our students, how we, as Internet searchers, have skills or don't have skills. I would argue this is a really fundamental thing that you need to be able to know how to do. You don't know how to do that, you're sort of effectively not as efficient a searcher as you could be. So what I mean by search literacy is really that search literacy is a combination of background knowledge and skills. This is the basics: how to drive, how to get things to work, how do you read the page. It's also a combination of knowing what's available. What kind of stuff is out there? What kinds of things can you search for? Then you have to know what's possible. So in addition to knowing what's out there, what kinds of things can you do with that? How can you possibly index and search and find that sort of thing? There's also the category of knowing search tactics, that is, in the sort of microscopic scale, how do you get to a particular goal? So we'll talk about that. We'll give you a bunch of examples, and we'll also talk about search strategies, these sort of how tactics get combined together in order to form a larger, longer-term organization of search. Lastly, we'll talk a little bit about evaluation, and this leads into a webinar in a couple of weeks where we'll be talking about how people look at credibility and authority in order to understand exactly what's going on. And I see a question from the audience here. Is there any difference between Control F and Firefox? That's a good question. The Control F character is used in all PCs, and Command F is used in all Macs. It's basically the same idea. It's just Apple does Apple things. Then there's a difference between browsers. And Firefox behavior is slightly different than Internet Explorer, and slightly different than Chrome, and certainly different than Opera. But the point is, being able to use the Control F find function within a web page is a really critical thing that you have to know how to do. So fundamentally, there's no difference. Superficially, they look slightly different. Okay? Now, you remember these days, right? Back in the days when we all had access to the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature, you would go to the library, and if you wanted to look up something in the magazine space, you would actually go and find yourself to the right volume, pull it out, turn to the right page, say page 168 as we see here, and we found the article we're looking for. Taking on the NCAA, we can change the world. This very first one right here by J. Nathan in some obscure publication. Now, of course, today we could do the following kind of thing, which is I would say taking on the NCAA And I discovered that, wow, look at this. There's in Amazon, they actually are republishing that article as a mini book. It's only 2,100 words, but you know what's going to happen. If we click on that, we'll see that we can actually go and download it, but it's $5.95. Okay, that's not what I want to do. Okay, so now I can go on. I can see this article is referenced. We can actually see it down here in the Chicago Tribune. If you keep looking through this, you can find multiple copies of this article. It's being linked to from many different places. The Chicago Tribune, it's being referred to in Questia, it's also in the Capan magazine, et cetera, et cetera. You can't do that with Periodical Guide. It's just impossible. We can see all the post references to that and see exactly where all this stuff is taking us. There we go. So one of the things I like to have our students understand is that the world is really shifting in interesting and fundamental ways. That was then, this is now. So let's talk about what background knowledge you need to know, because if you don't know the language, you can't sort of function in the culture. So we all know words like this, website, what a browser is, what a query is, but then one of the things that's interesting is people use words like URL and you don't really quite know what it means or what the different pieces of it are. So, for example, what's the top-level domain? That's the thing on the far right-hand side. And you need to understand that in order to understand later on how we're going to use the tactic of restricting your search to a particular domain or a particular country or a particular kind of website. So you need to understand these things in a little bit more detail than I think most people commonly have in their sort of day-to-day use. Then on the very end there's this thing called a plugin, right? You might know it as an add-on or extension. It's basically another piece of code that plugs into your browser and allows you to do various kinds of media things typically, usually like QuickTime or Flash or SVGs for scalable vector graphics. These are additional pieces of code that you have to add on to your browser in order to be able to get to all those extra interesting kinds of technologies that we all know and love. Now, when we're thinking about background knowledge for the web, I assume that everybody has this in their head, but in our studies, we've discovered that that's not really true. Students oftentimes don't understand the difference between the visible web and the deep web, and this is the kind of stuff you need in order to be literate. You don't know this, you don't understand the basics of how search works. So I drew this diagram to give you a little sense that we have, within the oval, we have a website. So these blue boxes are pages, and they're linked together by hyperlinks, or these links that go from a place in a document to another place in another document. And that's within the website, and then you have links that go outside the website. You have other websites, as you see in red. But look at those boxes up in the upper right in green. They're not connected to anything. What's the story? Well, the story is those are web pages that are not linked into the World Wide Web. They're isolates. They basically stand on their own. We can't find them. Google can't index them. You can't get there from here. So what that means is if there are, for example, content that's behind a paywall that the Google robot can't crawl over, or you bring up a website that's not connected to anything else, it's invisible. We just can't see it. Therefore, you can't find it. A common conceit you'll hear among students in particular is, well, everything is on Google. Let me be the first to tell you, everything's not on Google. In particular, all the green boxes and many of the red boxes that are behind, for example, robot.txt file that says you can't crawl my content, we can't see that, therefore you can't find it. A really great example of this is the Bureau of Labor Statistics. You see that URL on the bottom? That little funny URL, bls.gov, actually holds a wealth of content, a wealth of fantastic data sets you can crawl, peruse, and look at. But what's interesting about it is you can't actually search that. We can only search the metadata pages that describe each of those data sets. That's what Google can do for you, is take you to a header page for that, and then allow you to run the query that allows you to look for and access the content of that data set. Is that clear? What we're trying to do is get people the understanding that there's content that's crawlable and content that's not, and it varies from place to place and policy to policy. So now, typically, if you ask students, well, what's a what's a search engine? We all know about Google, we all know about Yahoo, we all know about Bing, but there are a lot of other ones too. For example, in other countries, there's Baidu in China, or Naver in Korea, Yandex in Russia, and so on. There are also a couple other search engines like Dogpile or Wolfram Alpha or DuckDuckGo and so on, they all have particular strengths, but they all have this sort of common characteristic that they crawl some kind of content on the web, and they find stuff, and then you use their interface to access that. They're limited to what they can crawl, and not all search engines crawl all content. So in particular, Yandex indexes content in Russia really, really well, and they sort of crawl the rest of the web. But they don't necessarily get around to all the content in all the other places to the extent that Google does. So each of these has a particular strength. They have weaknesses. Part of being literate is knowing what these things can do and what their weaknesses are, what their strengths are. If you have a question, by the way, just feel free to use chat. And I'm watching the sidebar here, and Tasha and I will try to answer your question. Okay? So let's go back to this idea about what it means to be literate. A literate reader of a search page knows the rhetoric of that page in the same way that we know, say, the rhetoric of Victorian English literature, or we know the rhetoric of modern, postmodern, apocalyptic literature. We understand that there's a particular structure for things like search pages, and that's what you're seeing here. So if you look at the very top, there's this address bar, or in the Chrome browser called the Omnibox. You can type in a URL or a query there. You can also use the regular old Google query box to type in a query, and you can see that we offer a list of suggestions below that. Now, interestingly enough, this kind of rhetorical structure, this kind of ordinary layout where suggestions pop below the query box is a pattern that Google established a while ago and is being now picked up by lots of other search providers. So this is a kind of common idiom, a kind of common trope you'll see throughout all of the search engines. A lot of the search engines also provide content on the left-hand side. These are usually filters and tools to allow you to modify the behavior of search, and it collectively is all on the left-hand side. Now, I want to make a distinction between the search engine and the browser. The browser is a tool you use to access search or any content on the web. So let's talk about the Omnibox in the upper left. The green lock indicates that this is actually a secure connection so that you can't be, for example, your passwords and your content, your searches can't be picked up by some random person sitting in a coffee shop in some place in the former Soviet Union. But what you can do is you can type your query there or type a URL there. Then just below that, you see in the Chrome, rather in the browser Chrome, you have a list of bookmarks, and then below that, in the black, you have the top bar of the Google search page. Okay? So when you switch from black to gray right there, you're switching from the browser, that is the container, the application that's running this, to the Google web page, which is black and everything below that. Okay? On the far right-hand side, you can see then there are two different sets of options. The Chrome option, which is trying to modify, let me switch back there. There we go. Which is modifying options having to do with the browser, and then below that with the gear icon, you get options that are affecting the way you're doing search. That's why we have two different layers of option setting right there. So you have to understand how the tool works. You want to be a literate mechanic, you've got to know how a socket set works. You want to be a literate reader of Victorian literature, you have to understand the conventions of the time. These are the conventions of our time. Now, if you look at a search results page, which is what you get back by doing a search, they also have a rhetorical layout. So in the center block here, we have at the very top, with a light yellow background, sort of a butterish yellow background, we have what we call top ads. These are ads. This is how Google makes most of its money, frankly, is by people clicking on these ads. We go to a lot of trouble to make sure these are separated from, clearly distinguished from, the organic search results, which is everything below that. Below the yellow box are the organic search results. So here we have ads on the top and ads on the right-hand side. You see this below this little map here? This map is not an ad. What it's actually doing is showing you the local results placed on a map, okay? You see the places down here in the organic search results. These aren't ads. These are actually the ones that are most appropriate for the query jewelry, given that you're located in Knoxville, Tennessee, okay? So we distinguish very carefully between ads in yellow or ads labeled on the right-hand side and organic results like the maps compendium of the places that show up in the organic results. All right. So that's the background knowledge you need to know. This is sort of what's fundamental. Now, I'm going to talk in each of these little sections, give you a little bit of amplification about each of these topics here within the notion of search literacy. So let's start with skills. This is the basics. This is what you need to know in order to be an effective searcher. Here's the first skill. You need to know how to read a result. Now, results, as you saw in one of those previous slides, like right here, always come in a stereotypic fashion, right? So let's actually unpack that a little bit and see what's there. The very top is the title from the web page. The title comes from the author of the page. So when you create the page, you give it a title. But if we, for example, if we discover 5 pages that have all exactly the same title, Google will modify the title slightly to reflect more distinctly what that page is from. So you can use that to understand what the whole page is going to be about. And then right below it in green, we have the URL. Below that in black, the black text there is a snippet, which is automatically generated summary of that page. So what happens is that summary is generated based on what your query is. In this case, the query was apricot. So the snippet is generated to answer that question as extracted from the text of that page. Below that, you see a set of other links, description here, cultivation and uses, etymology, and so on. These are shortcuts to places within this page. This basically are deep links within the structure of that page that basically you think of as shortcuts. So you want to get to the etymology of the word apricot, click on the blue link that says etymology. Okay? So that's one single result. Now, the good news is most everybody else does this too. Yahoo and Microsoft, we all follow kind of that same rhetorical style. We all have a green URL. We've all got a black title, a blue title with a link to the page and a black summary. You can see the summaries are generated slightly differently. So you choose which one you like. Now, part of the skill of being a literate searcher is knowing how to read the search page. One of the things we've seen that really good searchers do, this is from our observations, is that they know how to look for terms they don't know. I call this anti-reading. Some people call it word spotting. The idea is when you're looking for say, what's the idea behind a small sculptural model used as a prototype, you might look for words that you don't recognize, like this word maquette. So here in this case, this is a kind of word where I don't know what it is, so I'm thinking maybe this is actually the solution to my problem. I'm trying to understand what to call such a thing. So maquette actually, let's check that out. What you can do, actually let's go back here. What I can do is I can say maquette, I can do the query for maquette, like that. But what I really want to do in this case is that's pretty good. It says a French word for a scale model. I can also do define maquette. This is a kind of information literacy, a search literacy, where I can use the define operation to actually get to the Google definition, which is drawn from a dictionary. It's also drawn from words that we have crawled from the web. We see it being used in a definitional way, and we summarize those here. And so you see fantastic definitions for words that you otherwise might not know about, including words that are not in any dictionary, like, say, pwned. Here, we actually extract this word definition from the web uses, and that's what you're getting right here. Okay, does that make sense? Let me go back home there. So that's the skill of anti-reading. That is, looking through the web pages, looking for things you don't know, using that, following down that path a little bit. Another kind of skill is the skill of knowing how to read the snippet. So if we, for example, do a query like this one, Palo Alto recycled milk cartons, the question here is, does Palo Alto allow you to recycle milk cartons? Yes or no? Should be easy, should be simple. But I gave this question to 250 different Googlers and asked them that question. Half said yes and half said no. And here's why. If you actually look at the second result in the results list, it's this one right here, PSSI, Stanford Recycling Center. As you see, on the right-hand side, it says, blah, 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 the Palo Alto Recycling Center no longer accepts styrofoam, ... juice and milk cartons, and soy milk containers. Now, you might think that suggests that the Palo Alto Recycling Center does not accept milk cartons for recycling purposes. But you would be wrong. In this case, the ellipsis is hiding information, unintentional, I assure you, but it's hiding information that's really important to you. The distinction is that when people write an ellipsis, when they write that 3 little dots, the convention between the writer and the reader is that the writer is not hiding important information. But because the snippets are generated algorithmically without deep linguistic understanding, we can't make that assurance. What we're doing is trying to find fragments of text in the page that contains the words of the query, in this case, milk carton and Palo Alto Recycling. So what we've done is adjoined 2 potentially different interpretations in trying to maximize your ability to recognize if you should click on that landing page. Answer, yes, you should click on this landing page because the Palo Alto Recycling Center actually does accept milk cartons. So, moral of that story, you got to click through, particularly when there's potentially salient information hidden beneath an ellipsis. So, in addition to the tactical things and the mechanical things, there's also the skills of producing and maintaining your attention. Now, you and I both know distraction is wonderful. Serendipity is a fantastic thing. But we need to teach students the ability to focus. When students go into the library is also a marvelous place with a million distractors in it. You have to learn how to stay on task. The same thing is true on the web, except here we've got animation, we've got glitzy things, and potentially all manner of things that would just take you off task. When you're working with students, this is one thing you have to emphasize, is how to do that. Another kind of executive control self-monitoring task is monitoring the number of tasks you're pursuing at any one time. The problem you see with a lot of kids, and particularly in between, say, grades 8 through 12, is that they'll pursue too many tasks simultaneously and they'll drop a task. So in the process of trying to do multitasking, the number of tasks gets up above 3 or 4, then task number 1 just gets forgotten about. If it was writing that paper on Hume, then, you know, I'm sorry, we just didn't get around to it. So this is an important metacognitive skill, meta-attentional skill that we need to impart to our students. Now, part of the way of doing this is to provide a framework that would teach the skills of note-taking. Now, I do this sort of pathologically, so I'm an extreme case. But for, I think, people who are just trying to do regular research, one of the things you want to do is to, as you're working through, is take the time to make notes about your primary search task. What I do, you can see here in the lower right, is a fragment of my notebook, which I keep online. I keep it, and I've got it now for many, many years going back, and I do this diligently every day. The reason this is really important in the context of search is I can go back and discover what I was thinking about, what my task was, and I can go back for years. Mostly it's useful in the past month or two, so we'd go back to something I was working on and how I did that search before, because trust me, you are probably not going to be able to remember how you did that. So I'm able to very simply use my notebook to go back and do that. The other great advantage of a notebook for attention monitoring is to be able to take notes along the way. That is, as you do stuff, as you're doing your research, you may very easily find all kinds of stuff that's really interesting and you should follow up on. Take a note, get it in your notebook, get back on task. One thing that's important is I can tell you probably 4 or 5 different mechanisms for taking notes. Personally, I use Google Doc. I've got that. I can now search over all my Google Docs for the past several years. Works really well for me. A lot of people use sending themselves the email mechanism. Other people use, say, Microsoft Word to take their notes, or some other mechanism. But I think the world has moved beyond simple paper notebooks. I've still got a stack of paper notebooks in my garage, but the advantage of personal notebooks online is that you can search across all of your notebooks. That's an important thing to be able to do. The importance of having it being a comfortable, lightweight note-taking mechanism for you is it allows you to avoid distractions. You see something interesting, you note it, you handle it, you get it out of your main task, return to your primary search problem. Okay? Now, we all used to use bookmarks once upon a time. Some people still do. Some people have much more discipline than I do. What we see from our observations is that people tend to over-make bookmarks. And it tends to, in the very limited mechanism up on top of the browser, they tend to get gummed up, and people, unless you delete them diligently, they don't function very much. People fill them up and then sort of stop using it. That doesn't work anymore. Second big point to remember, don't assume that just because you were able to find something once, you'll be able to re-find it. Why is this important? Because the web constantly changes. The web is getting a massive amount of new content every single day. And the search path that you followed last time may or may not work for you this time. So one of the things you might want to be able to do is either write down the URL for something you found that you really like, or, and I actually prefer this, is copying the relevant content. One of the things I do a lot is I will copy fragments of a web page out, put it in my notebook, and put the link to that original page in with the notes so I can remember where I got it from. In cases where it's a dynamic content, I will take a picture. I'll take a snapshot. On a Mac, it's a Command-Shift-3 or Shift-4. On a PC, it's a use print screen trick. But I will take a picture of it and put that in my notebook as well. Third thing to remember here, remember that you can search your web history. You can both search the browser history, and if you have web search history turned on, you can go back until the dawn of time and discover the searches that you've run previously. Okay. So let's move on to browser facility. So one of the skills of using a browser is the ability to understand and know how to use tabs. Now, the good news is this is the kind of thing that people tend to pass around from person to person. But what I wanted to show you here is, let's go to Chrome here real quick. And I'll do a search for, say, the temple of Nike. And I've got these fantastic things here. And so what I want to do is I'm holding down Control key and opening that link in a new tab. I can now come down here and open that link in a new tab. And see, I haven't left my original search page. I'm opening all three of these. Oops, that was my mistake, actually. I accidentally let up on the Control key. So what I'm going to do is go back here. And we can see we've actually got these tabs here. And now I can very quickly go back and compare between tabs and my original search results. This is really handy when you're trying to do side-by-side comparisons of different versions of content, because we all know in doing deep research, you often want to triangulate between multiple perspectives on a single topic. This is a nice, simple way to do that within the browser. Again, I wanted to remind you, if you've got any questions, feel free to reach us through chat. Well, maybe it looks like somebody is. Let me check this real quick. How do you take a picture of a web page? I see that. So I'll show you here on the Macintosh. What I recommend is for the PCs, you just go do a search for screen capture. I actually use an application that you can buy these for like $15. That gives you a bunch of capability. But on the Mac, I'll show you how to do it. You do Command-Shift-4 and see how the cursor changes there. So what I can do now is sweep out this region. And what that will do is create a file on the desktop called picture. Okay? That's how you would do that. Again, for PCs, your mileage may differ. But basically, you can look up their keyboard shortcuts for doing something similar, involving the print screen keyboard in the upper right-hand side. The crosshairs don't show in the webinar. Sorry about that. That's a property of the way the operating system works. Not much I can do about it. So try it out on your own Mac, okay? So let's turn now, finally, to actually thinking about how you organize a search. The first thing to be thinking about is, what is it you're looking for? Now, that seems obvious and straightforward, but one of the things we see in poor searchers is not choosing particularly appropriate on-topic words. An exercise that some people use is to, for example, write out a single sentence. What is it you're looking for? And then highlight the terms, the key terms from that, and not actually include all the other words, right? So, for example, if you're trying to do a search for how jaguars run in the jungle, You might want to include the word jaguar and jungle, but you may not want to include the word jungle trail, because that would over-specialize the search you're doing. You may not want to include the word lope or gait, because again, that would take you down a particular biomechanical path, and you're looking for something else. Okay? That seems straightforward, but it's a skill, and it's one of the things we actually work on in our seminars when we're teaching. We also want to think about how would someone else talk about it, or how would they write about it? What words would they use? Because when you make the query is really asking for words that someone else would have written on this topic. So one way to think about this, it's not about you, it's about them. It's really about how someone else would write about this particular idea. Okay? Which of those terms would you want to see in your result? What's the perfect result? Think about that. Tasha's talked earlier about what it means to be predictive in your search. Use that as a way of guiding the way you choose your search terms. Now, another factor to consider, number 4 here, is which of those terms would be very, very specialized to a particular topic. Careful. Specialized words are really great, but oftentimes we'll see people misusing them. They'll use a word that they think is specialized for the topic, but it's really not. It's slightly off topic, at which point they're in deep yogurt. Because what happens is that they think they're using a word like, let's say, we're trying to do a search for how to treat a broken arm, and they use a word like fractionated. Now, they think that means fractured, but they got a different word. They misunderstand the word specialized. You want to be able to try to think of a word specialized, but not, you want to be sure you're choosing the right word. Last thing to think about, what's the perfect result? Visualize the perfect result for you. What would make you happy? Is it a particular single web page that gives me the answer? Or is it a collection of web pages, each with a different perspective on a topic that I'm trying to research? If I'm doing, say, a political analysis of the Euro crisis, I probably want to see papers from, say, Greece, as opposed to papers with articles from Germany, as opposed to papers from the UK, because they're all going to have very different kinds of responses. So think about what words are common, what words are specialized, what's going to be on the page, and what my perfect result would be. So one of the things that Google has that's really interesting is this thing that's called instant search. Now, a lot of people find it annoying, but I find it really interesting for the following reason. If, for example, I'm trying to do a search for a book about oranges by some Scottish writer, and I don't remember his name. What I can do is say oranges, and there's 2 things to notice here. First, I'm getting suggestions as I type that word. That's the stuff in the black box. That's what you're seeing here, oranges, oranges and sunshine, orangescape, and so on. These are suggestions that Google does based on the queries that other people make. The second thing you're seeing is that the results have already shown up here before I've actually finished typing. So let me go back, and I'll do that again. Now watch carefully. Orange, O-R-A-N-G, and see the results have shown up. I haven't typed the E yet. This is instant search. Now why this is great, so I say oranges book, and I can see both in the suggestion list right here, John McPhee, that's a Scottish name, and I can see the very first organic result here is this Amazon book pointing to the book Oranges by John McPhee. So without actually hitting enter or even finishing the thought, I've actually found the result. Now, a concern people might have is, doesn't this push people down a particular path? And we were worried about this too. So we were originally testing this years ago, well, 2 years ago. We actually measured the degree to which people followed the suggestion list versus followed their own query of interest. And we found, actually a little bit to our surprise, that people persisted in doing exactly what they wanted to do. This could be seen as a failure of suggest, but I think it's actually a success of people. What it means is that they're not being overly swayed by the suggestions they see. But when they do a suggestion, it actually was an accurate prediction of what they wanted. So it's a net benefit, and it turns out to not give people tunnel vision, which is the thing I was worried about. So the cool thing about instant is it allows you to very quickly explore a space. That's a great thing to know about how this works. Now, I know John McPhee is not Scottish. It's a Scottish name. Thank you. In response to the question. Actually, it's an interesting point because I knew that about the name, and I was counting on visual recognition to hand that answer to me very quickly. Okay? So I don't know how to search for a Scottish name, right, in searching for book authors. Now, let's illustrate this skill of doing smart keyword choice. One of the problems we give in our seminars is a question like this. We'll ask, what is that thing, that corner of your eye called where the upper and lower eyelids meet? How would you search for that? Think about that for a second. What would you do? So there are a couple of different approaches, but one thing you probably don't want to do is choose the word lacrimal gland. Yes, I know that's where the lacrimal gland is, but it's not going to give you the definition of the corner of the eyelids. It's too specialized. So I would go with something simple and obvious. For example, this search, corner of the eye. So if I did something like that, it's going to be a very straightforward, very short search. And if it's not right, you can always change it, right? But when I click on the first result for this query, it takes me to this very nice Wikipedia article for a term I did not recognize, medial canthus. So let's check this out. What's the medial canthus? Remember how to do this? Define. There we go. Define medial canthus. Okay, and here we have a very nice definition for it. Just to check, could somebody tell me if they can still hear me? We heard a funny noise over our voice channel. Can you still hear me? Yeah, okay, great, thank you. Good, so now you see what I did is I used a very simple search. I then checked it. This is a fundamental search skill, right? Never trust a single result. Never trust a single result. Okay, great. So let's go on to another version of a search skill. Another problem we give is that a friend told me there's a basketball team made of Chinese American men that played for money in the United States. What's the name of that team? Now, you can go off and solve that problem if you like. It takes most people several minutes to solve it. But I'll give you the shortcut here. The short answer is, one of the key ideas about being search literate is knowing how and when to use synonyms. We have a fantastic synonym system in Google, but we can't synonymize absolutely everything. So in this case, what you have to do is a query like Chinese American professional basketball team, where the word professional is a synonym for plays for money. Okay? And you'll very quickly, once you do that query, find out the Hongwon Kueis, where a San Francisco team that started in the 30s. From San Francisco, played all over the United States. Fantastic story. Key insight. You need to know how to choose your synonyms. Here's another kind of problem we give. We'll ask about what's this particular wildflower. In this case, I tell the students that it was in Henrico State Park, and I'm asking for what's the Latin name. Here's the close-up of the image. Now, recognize that the only way you're going to find this flower is if you do an image search. So how can you possibly do this? Well, you could do a search like this one up here, blue wildflowers Henrico. Or you could add it in a context term, like a context search term, like this word album or image collection. Because what we'd like to find is a collection of flowers, so we can look through that. We added the search term Henrico in there in order to geolocate the query, because there are infinite number of blue wildflowers worldwide, and this tells Google we really want Northern California Bay Area wildflowers. The answer is pretty straightforward. Triteletia laxa. You need to know how to frame your query to get the kind of result you want, in this case, the album. Okay. So let's go on to number 2 here. We talked a little bit about skills. That's a sort of like 5 or 6 of the fundamentals you need. Another piece of information you need to know is what's available. Well, what's out there on the web? And don't tell me everything. That's not a helpful answer, because it's not true to begin with. But in particular, there's an interesting problem that we have, which is we do have a lot of stuff, and it's all over the place. We have a 3D warehouse, for example, with 3-dimensional models of things. We have web pages, news streams, news archives, maps, magazines, scholarly papers. It goes on and on. So how do you know, as a searcher, what's possible to find? This becomes particularly interesting when you start thinking about products that we have like Google Earth or Google Books or Google Public Data Explorer, because those have their own huge data sets within them. So in Earth, for example, you can find locations. You just type in the name of, say, Taj Mahal, and it will fly you to that location. Or you can look for publication metadata from the books repository. And in Public Data Explorer, you want Consumer Price Index for the past 20 years, go find it there. Find the data set. But you as a searcher need to know what kinds of content and what kinds of content types are available to find. So an example of this is, do you know what's in Wikipedia? Wikipedia is a subset of the net. But do you know there's an article about heavy metal umlauts, like you see this one here? And you can see, if you go back to the revision history of this, how this article evolved over time. What's interesting about this is I never thought there would be an article about heavy metal umlauts at all. But Wikipedia, fantastic reservoir of unexpected things, shows me that it's not only an interesting topic, but fascinating. And if you want to see more about this, I recommend John Udell's screencast on this, the heavy metal umlaut discussion. My point, if you don't know what's in Wikipedia, you probably don't know what's in the rest of the web, right? So one of our problems here is knowing what's possible to find. Let me give you another example. I know some of you know about Wolfram Alpha, which is another search engine from the Wolfram Company, the same people who make Mathematica. Now, one of the real strengths of Wolfram Alpha is it has a fantastic science, technology, and education and math collection of stuff that they do. For example, you can type in an expression like this, which then now gives you graphs, fantastic graphs and solutions for that. They also have these very nice repositories of musical data. And you can even do data fitting, curve fitting, in this case a quadratic curve, regression curve, that fits this data set. So if you're a student and you don't know about this, you're damaged, you're hindered, you are not in touch with the range of possibilities. This becomes a very nice way to accelerate your learning of statistics, regression modeling, and the wealth of things that are possible in the mathematics world. Bing, our friends up in Washington, have an academic search, which is a kind of a correlate to our Google Scholar. They have a fantastic ability to, for example, plot an individual's publications over time, the number of citations, their G-index, and all that sort of thing. My point here is that you need to know what's out there in order to think about looking for it. So one of the things you can do here is to see everybody I've ever published papers with. You can see my co-citation frequency and who those people are, and walk down the graph of authors. Another really beautiful feature that you may not know about is that Google has this ability to search other languages. So in this case, we have the ability to, well, let me just show you how to do this. I'm going to go to Chrome. Oh, okay, somebody reported they lost audio. Can anybody else hear me? Or has everybody lost my audio? Okay, thanks. So what I want to do is just do a search like this, Nike Temple. And what I want to do is, for example, search under More Search Tools here. And you go down, you'll see Translated Foreign Pages. Okay. Translated Foreign Pages. I'm now searching for these different languages. But what I really wanted was Greek. I didn't want German, didn't want Italian, I didn't want Spanish, I didn't want French, but I do want, in this case, Greek. And now I've got results in Greek and nothing but Greek. And now if I click through those, you can actually go to the original page or to the translated version. Again, my point, if you don't know this kind of content exists, you're sort of in trouble. Okay? So this is knowing what's possible. Wow. Let me check to see what happened here. Okay. Sorry, we got to fast forward through this. Okay, we've got a bunch of stuff here, and what I'm trying to get to is we've got through heavy metal umlaut, through Wolfram, Bing, all these different kinds of things, and knowing what's possible, you have to understand that all of it is searchable. So we can do questions like this. These are the kinds of questions you could ask. What's the possible space? You can ask questions about population, or specific questions about the altitude of particular things, or conversions from one measure into another measure. Okay? You can ask even questions about the airspeed of an unladen swallow. Monty Python fans will appreciate that. Okay? But an interesting question is knowing what the range of permissible, possible, reasonable questions are. Asking a question like this, you'll probably spend a lot of time looking through stuff that may or may not be useful to you. That's sort of an undefined question in Google space. Okay? Now, could you ask a question like this? Sure. You're going to find lots of pictures of me. Here's another version of that. Could you find my mother's maiden name? Maybe. Maybe. Okay? So see what I'm trying to get to? Can you find a picture of Melville Dewey? Probably. Right? The author of the Dewey Decimal System. How about a picture of Melville Dewey hitting a home run? Probably not. But now you're starting to skirt on how you understand the space of possibilities in the web. If you know enough about Melville Dewey, you know that he ran a Florida resort for a while. There's probably a picture of him doing that. Okay? But I have fairly deep knowledge from the domain here that's guiding the space of what I can do. For students who are learning to research, they don't have a deep model of these domains, and so they don't know what's possible. Now, some of the things that are possible, you would think are possible, but in fact turn out to be relatively difficult, like searching for special characters. You can't search for the paragraph symbol, the pound symbol, the euro symbol, the copyright symbol, the @ sign. We don't allow that. You can search for strings that contain the sharp sign, like C# or hashtag. Okay? In general, we just delete those kinds of things, and we also will handle $signs in connection with numbers correctly. Okay? But otherwise, special characters are unsearchable. Now, one of the things that literate searchers have to understand is that we live in a fluid world where what's possible to do with search is changing moment by moment. So, for example, you've probably seen Google goggles. Here's an example. I go to Stanford, I pull out my phone, I take a picture of the Hoover Tower there on campus. It analyzes the picture for a while, and about 5 seconds later, it gives me the web page. This is querying the real world through images. There are tools out there like this one from Brian Dugan that allow you to recognize live performance of certain kinds of music, in this case, Irish session music. And you know about things like Shazam, and you know about being able to talk to your phone and ask for questions. It will speak to you and give you the answers. There's also tools like Siri out there that allow you to ask questions and get more complex answers. You also have to know that with tools like Google Public Data Explorer, you can look at data sets and do analyses like this. So there's two parts to this. What is out there to be able to be found, like these data sets, and what you can then do with that data, what you can do with the information. In this case, we can look at the unemployment rate. In this case, we see Santa Clara County, and we can overlay that with another county in California. In fact, you can do this with all the counties in all the states. But I'm showing you here that you need to understand what's possible to do in the context of the web. Okay. Here's another kind of example of that. A student comes and says, I want to do an analysis of the different meteorological patterns in 2 different locations. How can I do that? There is no web page that answers that. But with only a few steps, your student can understand how to find that data and transform it. So here I found the data, in this case from Wonderground. And I pulled out the data, pulled it into a CSV format, and I was able to plot it very simply. Another kind of thing you can do with Google Maps is actually measure distances. In this case, I'm actually looking at this is a trail, and I've measured it. And you can see it's, where is it, 3 miles. And this is actually computed automatically by the mapping program. Again, you have to know that's there before you can think about it. Here's a meta question for you. This is really about what's possible to do with content on the web. I'm telling you that there are these tools. How would you know that such a tool exists? For example, Google Maps has a tool, a fairly simple extension, that allows you to get the GPS coordinates for any location that you can drive the map to. I'll tell you the answer. For augmentations like that, remember the concept of plugin we talked about earlier? You're going to search for an extension to Google Maps. And that search bar is available through Google Maps itself, and it'll allow you to find extensions to the maps, for example, this one. More generally, part of search literacy is understanding that you can search for tools in addition to simple data. Okay. What this means is that you can search for and use data in different formats you might not have thought about. So you could, for example, take that lat long you got from that tool or from your favorite GPS application and actually dump that into Google Maps, and it will take you to that location, in this case, in the middle of Saudi Arabia. And that's the graph that is out of place for the Seattle versus Palo Alto map. The point there was I was able to do this transformation very, very quickly, in just a matter of minutes, making it what was previously an impossible task into a trivial task. Okay, so we're here at I see about halfway through my slides, and I've got 8 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is go through this relatively quickly and then wrap up with a kind of summary about where we're going to be going on the next few weeks. So part of search literacy is understanding both the strategy and tactics. Now, by tactics, I mean these sort of small things. Which context terms do you choose in order to create a particular kind of output? So in the previous example, we used CSV as a way of finding data tables. Okay? And another way to do this is, for example, to use advanced operators like the cite colon operator or file type. We've talked about that in a previous seminar. So there's an example. You can search for my name in the New York Times column website, and you'll get exactly that one result. So there are a lot of tactics, and over the course of this entire webinar series, we're trying to give you more and more of these. But one of the things I think is really interesting is to talk about the strategies that students employ, because while they're not necessarily learning on mechanics and tactics, they're not learning the strategies at all, and this is a bigger issue. For example, here's a problem about you doing this is a fairly complex search task. And the problem here is how do you find an answer to this problem where all the search terms are simple and obvious and very, very common. Code, decode, cliche, newspaper, what do you do? A strategy for solving this is to restrict the space of the search to something you could do and would actually have a chance of having those words being meaningful. One way to do that would be to look inside of a book using, say, Google Books. So you could use a book like David Kahn's The Code Breakers and then search inside of that. And you will find that the only cliche mention is with response to this story called Callaway's Code by O. Henry. The point here is that there are strategies that involve things like reducing the scope of search so only to semantically meaningful search terms. Okay? Now, one of the hallmarks of a strategic searcher, someone who has a rich understanding of how to search, is having a fallback. So one of the things that you would like to be able to do if you're a good searcher is, for example, when you land on a book and you can't actually, for some copyright reasons, look inside of it, a fallback is to look inside of Amazon and see if they've got a copy of that book where the copyright holder is given permission to Amazon to search within the book. Or to look in Project Gutenberg. You probably know about Project Gutenberg. It's a big collection of out-of-copyright, public domain books, say Moby Dick. The full text of Moby Dick is in Project Gutenberg. You can download it and do an extensive search and analysis of that if you'd like. Another strategy is to think about using different corpus. We have a lot of different kinds of content, and trivial for you to switch from Google web search to news search to image search and so on. I bring this up because it's an interesting strategic choice to make. For example, if the question is, what are all parts of a bicycle called? You could do this search in image search and look for diagram. So there the word diagram is a context term used in image search corpus space in order to find, guess what, parts diagrams of bicycles. And you can answer that question very easily. The strategic point to note is by switching corpus, you're switching the kinds of things that are indexed and the kinds of solutions you can get to problems. It's a great choice to make. Another kind of strategic knowledge thing to understand is what makes a good choice for a search term. So, for example, I can use Google Insights for search to look at a search like climate change, and I'll see that this is the chart of people searching for climate change over the past several years. Now, if I'm doing a search on climate change, do I want to use climate change or global warming? Here, I've compared the searches for climate change versus global warming, and you can see global warming totally outranks in total volume of queries the number of queries done on that topic. Thus, if I was searching for content area in this, I might prefer to start with the term global warming because there's going to be more articles written about it. I also, in my daily practice, use Google Alerts as a way of having a standing query that allows me to keep on top of a topic. So in this case, I would use a term like climate change as a way of getting background information so I don't miss those other kinds of things that are going on. There are a lot of different search strategies, and what we want to have our students know is how to link tactical steps together in order to form one of these bigger strategies. Okay? One of the things that experienced searchers do is know when to stop searching. That is, when they realize they're not succeeding and having a strong social network of friends to call upon when they have trouble. This is a really good thing for your students to have. Another kind of thing to understand is they need to understand that there's more than Google in the world. Libraries go to a lot of trouble to provide things like PubMed and ProQuest and things like that. They need to understand, though, when those are useful and what kinds of content they have. They need to understand the meta for that, what the meta catalog is for. Okay? So I realize I've only got 2 more minutes here, so I'm going to fast forward to a couple of these. And we're going to save this discussion of how to do evaluation of credibility and authoritativeness for the next webinar, which is in a week, where Tasha will be talking about credibility and authoritativeness, and she'll be covering this topic there. We'll be talking about spam and some what's understandable. I'm going to fast forward to this, so you'll see this in a week, and just summarize here. So search literacy is really how do we teach our students to frame their information need and choose the tools, content repositories so that they can get their problem done effectively. This is all about having them know what's possible, look out for content repositories, and understand how to use that, evaluate the quality of content found, and synthesize those results. What does this mean for us? For us, for you and I on this phone call, it means that we need to understand what search literacy is and how we teach it to our students. We have to be literate ourselves, and so what this really means is that we have to understand that this stuff is changing constantly. Things we're talking about today will stale quickly. You've got to have a plan for your own search literacy. You have to plan to keep this constantly going in your life. We're going to help you do this. In a week, Tasha will be talking about credibility and authority. In 2 weeks, I'll come back and we'll talk about additional kinds of resources like Scholar and Patents and so on. And we'll come back in 3 weeks and talk about extending your search skills.